John Harper had always believed that the piece of his sprawling ranch was his greatest treasure, nestled just beyond the reach of the nearest town. Miles of open fields stretched out under a wide blue sky, dotted with grazing cattle that were as much family to him as anyone else. It was quiet here, too quiet sometimes, but that's exactly why John loved it. The rustle of the wind through the grass, the distant call of a hawk, the slow, steady rhythm of life on the land. No traffic, no noisy neighbors, no constant watchful eyes. At least that's how it had been. That late afternoon, the sun hung low, casting long shadows across the dirt road that led to the ranch house, when an unfamiliar vehicle disturbed the silence. It was an SUV, black, unmarked, and out of place against the rustic landscape. John noticed it immediately as he finished checking the fence line. The SUV rolled slowly down the driveway, and two men stepped out, wearing dark uniforms with patches on their sleeves and badges gleaming on their chests. But something didn't feel right. John's years on the ranch had taught him to trust his instincts. These men weren't like the usual HOA board members who occasionally stopped by to complain about fences or landscaping. Their badges looked official, but also strangely generic. Not the kind you'd expect from a homeowners association. The patches on their arms bore a symbol John didn't recognize, and their uniforms, though dark and serious, had a cheap, almost theatrical quality. One of the men strode up confidently, his voice cold and clipped. "Mr. Harper, we're from the HOA Enforcement Division. There's been a complaint about violations on your property." John frowned. "HOA enforcement? Out here? I've never seen anyone from the HOA come this far. And what violations are you talking about?" The man flashed his badge closer, but John caught the way his hand trembled for a split second. "We're authorized to enforce community standards, no matter how remote the property. You're in violation of several HOA covenants, including unauthorized structures and livestock containment." John's eyes narrowed. "Unauthorized structures? My barns have been here 20 years, and the cattle are fenced as per the regulations. I want to see your identification, properly issued by the HOA board." The second man stepped forward, voice sharper now. "That's not necessary. You'll comply, or face consequences." John's skin prickled with unease. Something was off. The way they spoke, their vague threats, their unwillingness to produce official paperwork. It was intimidation, pure and simple. But who were these men really? And why had they come all the way to his ranch, miles beyond any HOA's usual reach? Before John could answer, the taller man glanced over his shoulder nervously, as if expecting trouble. The SUV's engine idled quietly nearby, waiting. John noticed the faint sound of cattle, stirring nervously in the distance. The herd sensed the tension too. John took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. This was no ordinary visit. Something darker was unfolding on his land, and these men were the strange heralds of it. He looked the HOA cops straight in the eye. "You're not welcome here. Leave now, or I'll call the sheriff." The two men exchanged a quick, uneasy look. The one with the badge forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We'll be back," he said, voice low and threatening. As the SUV sped away down the driveway, John's heart pounded with a mix of fear and fury. Who were these men really? And what was their real agenda? John's cattle had stopped grazing, eyes fixed on the road. Something was coming, and it wasn't going to be quiet anymore. John barely slept that night. He kept one hand on the loaded rifle, resting by the window, eyes scanning the dark fields. The two fake HOA enforcers had left tire tracks in his gravel driveway, and something colder in his gut. A prickling warning that this wasn't over. His dog Scout growled at the wind more than usual. Even the cattle didn't settle down there, low moos stretching into the early hours like nervous whispers. By morning, John was already dressed and outside, boots crunching against dew-soaked earth as he walked the perimeter. Nothing seemed out of place. No broken fences, no missing tools, no damage. But it felt wrong, like something invisible had crept across the land. Around mid-morning, his phone buzzed. Unknown caller. He let it go to voicemail. 30 seconds later, the same number called again. With a sigh, John answered. Harper. A distorted voice crackled through the speaker. You were warned, Mr. Harper. Non-compliance carries penalties. John's grip tightened. You're not real law. You come back here again, and I'll have the sheriff waiting for you. A short pause, then a slow mocking laugh before the line went dead. John stared at the phone, his jaw clenched. It was no bluff. These guys weren't just scammers. They were watching him, possibly even nearby. He moved fast, hopping on his ATV and driving to the north fence line, where the terrain sloped down into a narrow creek bed. It was the easiest place to sneak onto the ranch, and sure enough, there were fresh boot prints. In the dirt, someone had been inside the perimeter last night. He followed the tracks until they disappeared into dry brush. His stomach turned. These men weren't just pretending to be HOA enforcers. They were trespassing, hunting, and it wasn't property violations they cared about. They wanted something else. Back at the house, John reviewed the security footage from the cameras he'd installed a year ago, mostly to keep an eye on coyotes. One clip from 2:47 a.m. made his skin crawl. A flicker of motion near the barn. A figure, barely visible in the dark, walking slowly past the cattle pen with what looked like a flashlight. Then it disappeared out of frame. The cattle had all shifted away from the fence in the same moment, clearly aware of the intruder, even if the camera couldn't catch him clearly. That afternoon, the SUV returned. It parked on the road just outside the property line, not entering this time. The two men stood beside it, sunglasses on, arms crossed, just watching, like wolves waiting for a gate to open. John stood on his porch, with his rifle slung across his chest. He made no move to hide it. He didn't wave. He didn't blink. Eventually, the SUV drove off again, but the message was clear. They weren't going away, and now they weren't hiding either. John sat down at his kitchen table, pulling out the HOA documentation he'd stashed in a drawer years ago. Flipping through it, he found nothing that gave the association power to send armed enforcers, especially not in unmarked vehicles. So who were these men? And why his ranch? Suddenly, Scout barked furiously outside, teeth bared towards the tree line near the cattle field. John rushed to the window, just in time to see one of the cows stumbling backward, clearly agitated. Something had startled the herd again. He grabbed his hat, his rifle, and stepped out into the wind, his mind racing. The land had always been his, but now, someone was staking a claim that didn't belong to them, and they were willing to cross any line to get it. By morning, the atmosphere on the ranch had soured. The cattle were jittery, crowding together near the watering trough like they were afraid of the open fields. Scout paced non-stop along the porch, ears pinned back, snarling low at every rustle of the wind. Even the birds, usually chirping in the cottonwoods, had gone silent. John wasn't just unnerved. He was furious. He stood over a patch of trampled dirt just past the barn where the fence had been clipped. The wire had been cut clean, not chewed, or broken by a storm. Someone had walked through in the dead of night, and whoever it was had left behind something chilling. Pinned to one of the wooden posts was a note. A plain sheet of printer paper sealed in plastic, flapping gently in the breeze. Final notice. HOA enforcement will resume unimpeded access. Property resistance will result in escalation. This is your last chance to comply. No signature, no seal, just printed words, and the sense of a threat hanging heavy in the air. John stared at it for a long moment before yanking it down and crumpling it into his coat pocket. This wasn't about neighborhood bylaws or fence aesthetics anymore. This was an invasion. He stormed back to the house and dialed the sheriff's office. Caldwell County Sheriff's Office. Deputy Miller, this is John Harper. I've got trespassers on my land. Came twice. Fake HOA officers. They left a note. Threats. I've got tracks, footage, and now cut fencing. There was a pause on the line. Then, Mr. Harper, you're not the only one. What? We've had 2 other calls. Similar vehicles, similar claims. Both out in the county. These guys aren't with any HOA. They're not in our database. Not state, not local. John's pulse quickened. So what are they? That's what we're trying to find out. I'll send someone your way this afternoon. Keep inside. Stay armed. But John had no intention of waiting inside. By noon, the SUV was back, this time inside the gate. He hadn't heard it arrive. It just appeared, sitting arrogantly in the middle of the ranch's dirt road. Like it belonged there. The 2 fake officers stood beside it again, one of them filming with a phone, the other jotting something down on a clipboard. John approached slowly, rifle slung on his shoulder, hands open but ready. You were told to leave, he growled. The man with the phone smiled coldly. This is official inspection. You're being documented for non-compliance. Turn that camera off and get off my land. We're within our rights, the other replied, gesturing vaguely to the surrounding property. Livestock containment is a safety issue under section. There is no section, John cut in. Not one in any HOA agreement I ever signed. And sure as hell not one that gives you the right to trespass. The man filming didn't flinch. Your refusal is being recorded. Next visit will include asset tagging and property evaluation for enforcement recovery. Enforcement recovery, John repeated. What the hell does that even mean? Neither man answered. They turned and walked back toward the SUV, camera still rolling. That's when John's herd, agitated, spooked, began to move. A low rumble vibrated through the earth as several cattle trotted downhill toward the road. Eyes locked on the unfamiliar vehicle, one let out a sharp, startled moo, and then, like a switch had flipped, they surged forward. The fake cops didn't see it coming, and John didn't shout a warning. He simply stood still as the ground began to thunder. They had ignored his warnings. Now his land was about to answer for him. It began as a tremor beneath their boots, a low vibration that turned into a rumble, then into thunder. The 2 fake enforcers froze as the first dozen cattle crested the ridge, hooves pounding the dirt like war drums. Dust kicked up in their wake. John didn't move from his spot on the porch, rifle still slung over his shoulder. He simply watched the land speak for itself. What the? One of the men shouted, pointing toward the fast-approaching herd. The other scrambled to the SUV. Get in the car! Get in! But it was already too late. The lead steer, a hefty black Angus named Bruiser, all muscle and momentum, charged down the slope with terrifying speed. Behind him, the rest of the herd followed in a unified wave of motion, driven by fear, confusion, and instinct. John didn't blame them. Cattle were creatures of rhythm, of peace, but they were also protective of their territory, and they knew when something didn't belong. The first fake cop dove into the passenger seat, slamming the door. The second one barely made it inside before the first impact came. Bruises. Massive frame slammed into the grille of the SUV with a bone-shaking crunch. Metal crumpled. The front axle groaned. The vehicle jolted. Tires screeching as it rocked violently from the blow. One headlight popped loose and skidded across the dirt. Then the rest of the herd arrived. Cattle hit the sides of the SUV like a wave of flesh and fury. One cracked a side mirror clean off. Another climbed partially onto the hood before sliding off with a snort of rage. The windshield shattered under the sheer force of a second impact, spiderwebbing into useless fragments. Inside the SUV, the fake cops were screaming, panicked, trapped. John walked down the porch steps, slow and steady. The SUV rocked again, this time leaning sideways. As a wheel sunk into the soft shoulder of the road, one of the cattle knocked into the rear bumper so hard it crumpled in like foil. The entire frame groaned under the assault. Scout barked furiously from the porch, tail wagging like this was the best show he'd seen all year. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the driver managed to throw the SUV into reverse. Tires spun, kicking up dust and gravel, but the vehicle only managed to lurch backward a few feet, directly into a ditch. The rear tires lifted helplessly into the air. The SUV tilted, bottomed out, and died with a mechanical cough. Smoke hissed. From the hood, the cattle began to pull back, now that the threat was neutralized. A few snorted once more at the broken vehicle, then wandered off toward the creek. Bruiser, proud as a general, lingered a moment, staring directly at the two trembling men inside the ruined SUV, then turned and trotted back to the herd. John finally approached, stopping just a few feet from the wreck. The window rolled down partway. A face, pale, sweating, wide-eyed, peered out. "You're crazy," the man muttered. "That was attempted manslaughter." "Nope," John said calmly. "That was a natural reaction from a herd on private property. You were warned." Repeatedly, the man opened his mouth to protest, but John raised a hand, silencing him. "You set foot on this land again," John said, voice cold as steel. "And next time it won't be cattle. It'll be me." He turned and walked back toward the house, leaving the SUV wheezing in the ditch, its fake authority crushed under hoof and hubcap. As he stepped onto the porch, a sheriff's cruiser appeared on the horizon. Perfect timing. John smiled grimly. Now it was time to find out who these men really worked for. The sheriff's cruiser rolled up slow, kicking dust behind it as the patrol lights flickered lazily in the noon sun. Deputy Miller stepped out, hand resting on his sidearm, eyes narrowing at the wrecked SUV still lodged in the ditch. John stood, with his arms crossed at the edge of his porch, watching. Inside the SUV, the two fake enforcers were arguing, one yelling into a phone, the other fumbling through a glove box, trying to look busy, but they didn't climb out. They didn't try to run. The shame was starting to settle in. Miller walked over to John. "Heard the radio chatter. You all right?" John nodded once. "Better than their car." Miller let out a breath through his nose as he surveyed the crumpled vehicle. "Damn, looks like a demolition derby. Cattle got spooked. Couldn't stop 'em. These two were trespassing again. They armed. They weren't earlier, but I wouldn't be surprised." Miller walked toward the SUV with the kind of slow confidence only a seasoned lawman could carry. He rapped on the cracked window with 2 fingers. "Out, now." The passenger's door creaked open. The man inside stepped out, dusted himself off, and immediately started in with a lawyer's cadence. "We're with the Central Prairie HOA Compliance Division. This land falls under extended covenant enforcement." Miller cut him off. No, you're not. He held up a printed document. I already checked with the county clerk. This land hasn't had active HOA jurisdiction for 13 years. The original association dissolved. What you're doing out here, it's impersonation of law enforcement, trespassing, and attempted fraud. The second man opened his mouth to argue, but Miller was faster, reaching into the SUV and pulling out a laminated ID badge. He held it up. This looks official to someone who doesn't know better, but I ran the emblem through the sheriff's database. He flipped it over. The badge number belongs to a defunct private security firm out of New Mexico, shut down 5 years ago after a lawsuit. You boys are wearing dead skin. John felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest. He stepped closer. So who's paying? You? He asked. The men exchanged a glance. Miller smiled without humor. You want to talk here, or in a cell? Either way, we're going to get it. After a tense moment, the driver muttered, We're contractors, just following orders. Some corporate outfit sent us here to collect. Collect what? John snapped. This isn't a storage unit. The man looked at the ground. The land! Silence fell like a hammer. Miller frowned. What corporate outfit? Redmont Holdings. The man finally said. They sent letters. No response. So they said we could escalate under dormant covenant codes. John blinked. Redmont. The name meant nothing to him. But the implications hit like a punch to the ribs. Redmont doesn't own this land, he said flatly. Never did. They will, the driver said. Soon as the foreclosure claim finalizes. John's blood ran cold. What foreclosure? The man offered a thin smile. The one you didn't know was filed against you 2 weeks ago. Miller stepped back, jaw clenched. That's not possible. But the man continued. Redmont's been buying up abandoned HOA claims all over the county, digging through archives, reawakening old liens. Yours is next. John stared at the wrecked patrol car. The cattle had crushed their vehicle, but not the machine behind them. A bigger game was being played, and this ranch was just one square on the board. John slammed the door of his study behind him. Heart pounding harder than it had during the cattle stampede, a foreclosure he'd never heard about, a corporate ghost town of an HOA resurrected by some shell company, and now this Redmont Holdings, claiming rights to land passed down from his grandfather. He yanked open the filing cabinet, yanked out a thick manila folder, marked Harper Deed, 1974, and dropped it onto the desk. Paper rustled as he flipped through contracts, maps, tax receipts, everything, all legal, all current. Nothing in his title records showed even a whisper of a lien. So what the hell were they talking about? He sat heavily in his chair, rubbing his jaw. Then he remembered something. Grandpa's old land box. A steel thing, locked. Kept under the floorboards of the storage room. He hadn't opened it in years. Within 5 minutes, he'd pried up the warped boards and hauled the thing out. The key still hung on a nail in the kitchen. He opened it. Inside, an envelope, yellowed and brittle. It read, in Grandpa's blocky handwriting, Condemned HOA scam. Do not ignore. John's fingers trembled as he unfolded the paper inside. It was a letter addressed to future Harpers, dated 1992. If you're reading this, it means someone came sniffing around again. Back in '89, I caught a group calling themselves Prairie-Wide Land Management, trying to buy out half the neighborhood, using HOA technicalities. They forged covenants, claimed unpaid fees. We fought 'em off, but I never trusted it was truly over. They kept the shell going, filing legal claims with no teeth, waiting for someone to get careless or die. John sat back, chills crawling across his neck. Prairie-wide. Redmont. Different name, same beast. They'd been lurking in the shadows for decades, waiting for a moment of legal distraction or landowner ignorance. This wasn't foreclosure. This was fraud. A generational con. He pulled out his laptop, heart racing, and typed in Redmont Holdings plus HOA plus lawsuit. Bingo. 3 class actions in Colorado, 1 in Arizona, a small-town case in Kansas that mysteriously vanished mid-trial. Then, a headline from just 3 months ago, rural HOA scams on the rise. Old liens, new shells. John clicked. His stomach turned. The story told of a trend. Shadow companies like Redmont buying up abandoned HOA records, reactivating old covenants, and filing legal claims, hoping homeowners wouldn't know how to fight back. He scanned to the bottom, and stopped cold. One of Redmont's newest acquisitions includes a portfolio previously owned by Prairie-Wide Land Management, a defunct firm with a history of falsified land records. Grandpa had been right. John was up and moving. Before he even realized it, he grabbed the land deed, the envelope, his laptop, and a small flash drive he kept for emergencies. He had names now, documents, patterns. He wasn't just going to defend his ranch. He was going to expose them. By the time he reached the county records office, Miller was already waiting, thumbing through a file with an expression halfway between confusion and fury. "You were right," the deputy muttered. Their foreclosure filing was time-stamped 2 weeks ago, but the records were backdated to last year. It got through because someone on the inside flagged your property as inactive. John leaned in. "Which clerk?" Miller hesitated, then slid the file across the desk. Name's Alan Pike. Temporary hire. Worked here 2 months. Guess where? He worked before that. Redmont, John whispered. Miller nodded grimly. "They've infiltrated the system." John's eyes narrowed. "They thought I was just a stubborn rancher with an old dog and a few cows," he said. "They forgot. I've got something else too." "What's that?" John picked up the deed, held it in the light. "A legacy that fights back." John didn't sleep that night. While Scout snored on the rug and the ranch house creaked in the wind, John stayed up printing copies of every deed, every suspicious document, every note his grandfather had scribbled into the margins of his old files. By dawn, 3 manila folders lay ready, 1 for the sheriff's office, 1 for a land rights lawyer Miller recommended, and 1 for the press. He knew what he had to do now. Redmont had been playing their game from the shadows. It was time to drag them into the light, and John had one advantage they hadn't counted on. Small-town memory. He started with local radio. The owner, Howell, had known John since high school. By noon, Howell was broadcasting a bombshell segment across the county, detailing how Redmont Holdings, under various names, had been targeting aging ranchers, reactivating fake HOA liens, and trying to steal land right out from under them. Then, story spread like wildfire. But John wasn't done. He emailed every news outlet he could find, uploaded files to whistleblower sites, and tipped off landowner advocacy groups. Within 24 hours, John's story was front page on several watchdog blogs. He was getting emails from victims as far as Utah and Oklahoma. Then came the call. "Mr. Harper," a slick voice said over the phone. "This is Nathan Crowley with Redmont Legal Affairs. We'd like to discuss a peaceful resolution to the situation." John smiled bitterly. "Now you want peace? We believe this has been a simple misunderstanding. Our agents may have acted outside their intended authority. We'd like to settle quietly. No lawsuits, no countersuits. We're prepared to offer a 5-figure payout for your time and inconvenience. John didn't even blink. Stick your 5 figures where your HOA doesn't reach. A pause. You understand this could escalate legally. I hope it does, John growled. Because this time, I'm bringing the fight to you. He hung up. But an hour later, escalation came faster than he expected. A convoy of 3 black SUVs crept down the long dirt road to his ranch, kicking up a slow-motion storm of dust. They weren't sheriff's vehicles, and they sure as hell didn't look like neighbors coming to help mend a fence. Scout barked like mad. John stepped out onto the porch, with his rifle slung over one shoulder, not aiming, but not hiding it either. The SUVs parked in a V formation, and a man in a charcoal suit stepped out of the lead vehicle. He looked more Wall Street than back road. His polished shoes left neat prints in the dirt. "Mr. Harper," the man said, "I'm here to deliver. An injunction. You've been served." He handed over a thick stack of papers, legalese bristling with threats. Cease and desist. Defamation. Unlawful obstruction of corporate operations. John flipped through it, unimpressed. "You bring cops. With those papers?" he asked. The man smiled faintly. "We won't need them. We've got lawyers, judges, time." John looked out across the land behind him, the grazing cattle, the windmill, the old cottonwoods, and back to the man. "Time's the one thing you don't have," he said flatly. "Because starting tomorrow, I go public on national radio. I've got documents, witnesses, recordings. Your whole scheme's unraveling, and when it does, you'll wish this had ended with a busted patrol car." The man's smile slipped. "I suggest you leave," John added, "before the herd gets curious again." The man glanced nervously at the field, where bruisers stood, as if he remembered the headlines. They left, but John knew this wasn't over. Redmond wouldn't give up. They'd dig deeper, strike harder, and if they were pulling strings inside the legal system, the final showdown might come not with cattle, but in a courtroom. Or worse, under cover of night. John awoke to the low hum of a drone. He sat up, heart thudding, reaching for the old Winchester by the bed. Scout growled beside the nightstand, ears perked, eyes narrowed. He peeked out the window. Another black SUV parked at the gate, but this time there were no suits, no lawyers, just 2 figures in dark tactical gear, leaning against the hood like they owned the land. He felt it in his gut. This wasn't a legal move. It was a scare tactic. Redmond was desperate now. John grabbed the flash drive, tucked it into his pocket, and walked out the front door like it was just another morning. The 2 men looked up. Their posture stiffened when they saw the rifle across his back. "You've been warned," one said, stepping forward. "You're violating a legal order." John didn't stop walking. "Get off my land," he said calmly, "or we're done talking." The man reached into his jacket. Scout let out a thunderous bark, and from the hills, a ripple of lowing broke the silence. Cattle, moving fast. John had left the pasture gate open. Out came Bruiser and the rest of the herd, charging down the slope like furry battering rams with horns. The 2 fake enforcers spun to see the stampede thundering toward them. "You didn't learn the first time," John muttered. They dove into their SUV, tires spitting dirt as they peeled off down the road, chased for half a mile by 2,000 pounds of irritated livestock. But John didn't smile. He knew what came next wouldn't be brute force. It would be the courtroom. Or worse, silence. That night, under the kitchen's yellow light, he recorded a video. In it, he laid out everything. The fake enforcers, the false foreclosure, the buried history his grandfather warned about. He named names, showed documents, highlighted the Redmont to Prairie-wide connection and the clerk who altered county records. Then he made one final promise. I'm not just fighting for my ranch. I'm fighting for every landowner who got blindsided by a forgotten clause or a fake badge. You want war? You've got it. You can sue me, smear me, or send another SUV. I'll meet you with truth. And if I disappear, know this. The files are backed up, copies mailed, and my cattle still remember how to aim. He posted the video to every platform he could, emailed it to every journalist who'd ever answered him, and went to sleep with the Winchester loaded beside the bed. In the days that followed, the video exploded. First local news, then national. Landowners from 6 states came forward with similar stories. A former Redmont intern leaked internal memos showing full awareness of the fraud. Legal groups mobilized. Lawsuits were filed. A federal investigation opened. And then came the twist. A whistleblower from the county office released security footage of Alan Pike, the Redmont planted clerk, slipping a USB drive into the county system after hours. But he wasn't alone. The man beside him was wearing a sheriff's department badge. Deputy Sanderson, Miller's second in command. Redmont had help on the inside. Miller, sick with rage, fired Sanderson and turned over everything to the feds. Within a week, Redmont's CEO resigned. The fake liens were voided. The injunctions dropped, and John Harper's ranch was officially, publicly, and permanently cleared of all claims. Epilogue: John stood at the edge of his property one last time that summer, scouted his side, watching Bruiser graze peacefully under the wide Texas sky. A reporter had asked him what it felt like to beat a company that size. He'd thought for a moment and said, "It's not about beating them. It's about reminding them who this land belongs to." He scratched Scout behind the ears and turned back toward the house, where an unopened envelope from the state attorney general sat on his porch. It had one line inside: "Thank you for waking the herd.